There is a kind of struggle that doesn't announce itself loudly. It moves quietly beneath the surface of our lives, unseen tensions, unspoken betrayals, silent opposition. And often the deepest wounds we carry are not from visible battles, but from hidden ones. Enemies we cannot name, forces we cannot fully understand, patterns that seem to repeat without explanation. Hidden battles shape visible struggles in ways most people never fully recognize. What we see on the surface of someone's life, their reactions, their conflicts, their patterns of behavior, is often just the visible expression of something much deeper and largely unseen. A person may appear angry, defensive, anxious, or withdrawn, but those outward expressions are rarely the true origin of the struggle. They are symptoms, not causes. Beneath them lies a quieter, more complex reality shaped by past experiences, emotional wounds, internalized beliefs, and unresolved pain. These hidden battles often begin long before we are even aware of them. Early life experiences, especially those tied to fear, rejection, neglect, or betrayal, leave imprints on the mind and body. Over time, these imprints become internal narrative stories we carry about who we are, what we deserve, and how safe the world is. Without realizing it, we start to respond to present situations not as they are, but as they feel through the lens of those past wounds. A small disagreement may feel like abandonment. A moment of criticism may feel like a deep personal attack. The reaction seems disproportionate on the outside, but internally it is connected to something much larger and older. In this way, hidden battles quietly dictate visible outcomes. Relationships become strained not because of what is happening now, but because of what has never been resolved. Opportunities are avoided not because they are truly dangerous, but because they trigger an old sense of inadequacy or fear. Even self-sabotage can emerge as a protective mechanism, rooted in a hidden belief that success is unsafe or undeserved. What appears to be weakness or failure is often the mind's attempt to cope with something it has not yet healed. There is also a physiological dimension to these hidden struggles. The body keeps a record of stress and trauma. When a person has experienced prolonged emotional strain, their nervous system can become conditioned to remain in a state of alertness or defense. This means that even in moments of calm, the body may still react as if there is a threat. The visible behavior, restlessness, irritability, exhaustion, is not random. It is the body responding to an internal alarm that was never fully turned off. Spiritual language often describes enemies as external forces, but there is a profound truth in recognizing that some of the most influential enemies operate within. Doubt, fear, shame, and resentment can quietly shape decisions and distort perception. They are not always loud or obvious. In fact, their power often lies in how subtly they operate. They convince a person that their reactions are justified, that their limitations are permanent, that their struggles are simply who they are. The difficulty is that what is hidden tends to remain unchallenged. If a person is not aware of the deeper roots of their struggle, they will continue trying to fix surface-level problems without addressing the underlying cause. This can lead to frustration as the same patterns repeat despite efforts to change. True transformation requires looking beyond what is visible and asking deeper questions. Why does this situation affect me so strongly? Where does this reaction come from? What part of me feels threatened or unsafe? When these hidden battles are acknowledged, something begins to shift. The visible struggles start to make sense. There is less self-judgment and more understanding. Instead of seeing oneself as broken or flawed, it becomes clear that these responses developed for a reason. They were at some point necessary for survival or protection. But what once protected can later limit, especially if it remains unexamined. Bringing awareness to these hidden dynamics does not instantly erase them, but it changes the relationship a person has with them. Instead of being unconsciously driven by them, there is an opportunity to observe, reflect, and gradually respond in new ways. The struggle becomes less about fighting what is visible and more about understanding what is hidden beneath it. Awareness is the beginning of deliverance, but it is often misunderstood. Many people assume that change begins with effort, discipline, or external action. They try to fix what feels broken by pushing harder, praying louder, or forcing themselves into different behaviors. Yet without awareness, these efforts often circle back to the same patterns. True change does not start with control, it starts with seeing. To become aware is to pause and observe what is actually happening within you, without immediately trying to escape it or justify it. It is the willingness to notice your thoughts, your emotional reactions, and even your bodily sensations as they arise. This sounds simple, but it is deeply challenging because much of what we carry internally has been pushed out of conscious view. Over time, the mind learns to avoid discomfort, to suppress pain, and to normalize patterns that were never meant to be permanent. When awareness begins, it can feel uncomfortable. You may start to notice how often fear influences your decisions or how certain situations trigger a disproportionate reaction. You may recognize patterns of avoidance, self-doubt, or even resentment that you had previously overlooked. This is not a sign of failure, it is a sign that something hidden is becoming visible. What was once automatic is now being brought into conscious recognition. There is a quiet power in simply naming what is happening. When a person can say, "This is fear," or "This is an old wound," being activated, they create a small but significant distance between themselves and the reaction. Instead of being consumed by the experience, they begin to witness it. That shift from identification to observation is where deliverance begins to take root. Awareness also interrupts the cycle of unconscious repetition. Many struggles persist not because they are too strong to overcome, but because they operate unnoticed. A person may repeatedly enter unhealthy relationships, not realizing they are drawn to familiar emotional patterns from the past. Another may constantly undermine their own progress, unaware of a deep belief that they are not worthy of success. Without awareness, these cycles feel inevitable. With awareness, they become understandable. Spiritual language often speaks of light overcoming darkness, and awareness functions in a similar way. Darkness is not something that needs to be fought directly, it simply disappears when light is introduced. In the same way, many internal struggles lose their grip when they are seen clearly. The secrecy that once gave them power begins to dissolve. What felt overwhelming becomes something that can be explored, understood, and eventually transformed. There is also an element of compassion that naturally emerges with awareness. When you begin to see the roots of your own struggles, it becomes harder to judge yourself harshly. You start to recognize that your reactions, even the ones you wish to change, develop for a reason. They were attempts, sometimes imperfect, sometimes limiting to protect yourself from pain. This understanding does not excuse harmful behavior, but it creates a foundation for change that is rooted in understanding rather than shame. Awareness does not demand immediate answers or instant transformation. It invites curiosity instead of judgment. It asks you to stay present with what is, rather than rushing to what should be. In that space, something subtle but profound begins to happen. Mind becomes less reactive, the body less tense, and the sense of being controlled by unseen forces begins to loosen. Over time, this growing awareness creates the conditions for deeper healing. It opens the door to new choices, new responses, and a different way of relating to yourself and the world around you. What once felt automatic becomes intentional. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. And what once felt hidden begins to lose its hold as it is brought into the light of conscious understanding. Not all enemies are outside of you, and this realization can be both unsettling and deeply liberating. It challenges the instinct to look outward for the source of every struggle, every delay, every frustration. It asks a more difficult question: what within me is contributing to what I am experiencing? This is not about blame or self-accusation, but about understanding the internal forces that shape perception, reaction, and behavior. It is often easier to identify external opposition. When someone wrongs us, criticizes us, or acts against us, the enemy appears clear and defined. There is a face, a name, a situation we can point to. But the internal landscape is far more complex. The mind can generate narratives that distort reality, amplify fear, or reinforce limitations without us even noticing. These inner patterns can become so familiar that they feel like truth rather than interpretation. Fear is one of the most influential internal enemies. It does not always present itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, as overthinking, as the quiet voice that says you're not ready or this might go wrong. Over time, this voice can shape decisions in subtle ways, leading a person to avoid risks, miss opportunities, or remain in situations that no longer serve them. From the outside, it may look like caution or indecision, but internally it is often rooted in a deeper sense of insecurity or past experience. Doubt operates in a similar way. Questions ability, worth, and potential, often without evidence. It can take the form of comparing oneself to others, minimizing achievements, or expecting failure before even trying. This internal dialogue can become so persistent that it defines how a person sees themselves. The danger is not just in the thoughts themselves, but in how they influence action. When doubt is left unexamined, it quietly limits what a person believes is possible. There is also the presence of unresolved emotional pain. Experiences of rejection, betrayal, or neglect can leave lasting impressions that shape how a person relates to others. Trust becomes difficult, vulnerability feels unsafe, and connection may be avoided or approached with caution. These responses are not conscious choices, they are protective patterns formed over time. Yet they can create isolation or conflict, which then seems to confirm the very fears that caused them. Another internal enemy is the tendency toward self-judgment. Many people carry an inner critic that is far harsher than any external voice they encounter. It points out flaws, magnifies mistakes, and dismisses progress. This constant criticism can erode confidence and create a sense of inadequacy that influences every area of life. Even in moments of success, the inner voice may shift the focus to what is still lacking or what could go wrong next. What makes these internal enemies particularly powerful is their invisibility. Because they operate within, they are often mistaken for reality. A thought feels true simply because it is present. An emotion feels justified simply because it is strong. Without awareness, there is no distinction between what is happening and the interpretation of what is happening. Recognizing that some of the struggle comes from within does not invalidate the existence of real external challenges. It simply adds another layer of understanding. It allows a person to respond more clearly rather than reacting solely from habit or emotion. Instead of being driven by fear, doubt, or past pain, there is an opportunity to question these influences and choose a different response. This shift requires honesty. It asks for a willingness to look inward without defensiveness, to notice patterns without immediately trying to justify them. It involves acknowledging that some of the barriers we face are not imposed entirely from the outside, but are reinforced by internal beliefs and reactions. This recognition is not meant to create guilt, but to open the possibility of change. As these internal dynamics become more visible, their hold begins to weaken. The thoughts that once felt absolute can be questioned. The reactions that once felt automatic can be paused. The patterns that once felt permanent can be reevaluated. In this process, the idea of enemy begins to shift from something to be fought blindly to something to be understood and, ultimately, transformed through awareness and intentional response. Truth dissolves what secrecy protects, and this principle operates quietly but powerfully in every human life. What remains hidden tends to maintain its influence, not because it is inherently strong, but because it is unchallenged. Secrecy creates a kind of internal shelter where fears, wounds, and distortions can exist without being questioned. In that hidden space, they grow, shape perception, and influence behavior, often without the person fully realizing it. Secrecy is not always intentional. Much of it develops as a form of protection. When an experience is too painful, too confusing, or too overwhelming, the mind learns to push it out of awareness. This is not weakness, it is a survival response. A child who feels rejected may not have the capacity to process that pain, so it becomes buried. Over time, however, what is buried does not disappear. It continues to operate beneath the surface, influencing how that person relates to others, how they interpret situations, and how they see themselves. The challenge is that what is hidden often shapes reality more than what is visible. A person may find themselves reacting strongly to situations that seem minor without understanding why. They may carry a sense of unease, insecurity, or tension that does not seem connected to anything specific. These are often signals of something deeper that has not yet been brought into awareness. The secrecy surrounding it gives it power because it cannot be examined, questioned, or understood. Truth in this context is not just about factual accuracy. It is about seeing clearly, recognizing what is actually present within you without distortion or avoidance. This kind of truth requires honesty, and honesty can feel uncomfortable. It may reveal patterns that are difficult to accept, emotions that have been suppressed, or beliefs that no longer serve you. But this discomfort is part of the process of dissolving what secrecy has been protecting. When truth is acknowledged, something begins to shift. The hidden becomes visible, and what is visible can be understood. A fear that once felt overwhelming may be recognized as rooted in a past experience rather than the present moment. A pattern of behavior may be seen not as a fixed trait, but as a learned response. This shift from unconscious reaction to conscious understanding reduces the intensity of the experience. There is also a sense of release that comes with truth. Holding something in secrecy requires energy. It involves constant avoidance, distraction, or suppression. When that burden is lifted even partially, there is more space for clarity and calm. The mind no longer needs to work as hard to keep something hidden, and the body can begin to relax its state of tension. Truth also interrupts the narratives that secrecy sustains. When something remains hidden, the mind often fills in the gaps with assumptions or distorted beliefs. These narratives can become deeply ingrained, shaping identity and expectation. Bringing truth into the light allows those narratives to be questioned. It creates an opportunity to separate what is real from what has been constructed out of fear or misunderstanding. This process does not require public disclosure or dramatic confession. Truth can begin internally, in the quiet act of acknowledging what you feel, what you fear, and what you have experienced. It is about allowing yourself to see without turning away. In that space, there is a gradual dismantling of what secrecy has maintained. As truth becomes more present, the grip of hidden struggles weakens. What once operated in the background begins to lose its influence. Reactions become less automatic, thoughts less convincing, and emotions more manageable. The internal environment becomes clearer, and with that clarity comes a different way of responding to life, one that is not driven by what is hidden, but guided by what is understood. Divine justice aligns with inner healing in a way that is often overlooked when people think only in terms of external outcomes. Many imagine justice as something that happens outside of them, wrongdoers being exposed, situations being corrected, or harm being visibly repaid. While these aspects may exist, there is a deeper dimension of justice that unfolds within the human experience. It is not only about what happens to others, but about what is restored, corrected, and healed inside of you. When a person has been hurt, betrayed, or treated unfairly, there is a natural desire for things to be made right. This desire is not wrong. It reflects an innate sense that truth matters and that harm should not go unanswered. However, when this longing becomes solely focused on external validation or revenge, it can keep a person tied to the very pain they are trying to escape. The mind replays the event, the emotions remain active, and the sense of injustice continues to shape how they feel and respond. Inner healing introduces a different movement. Instead of waiting for the external situation to resolve, attention begins to shift inward. What has this experience done to me? What beliefs has it created? What emotions am I still carrying? These questions are not about excusing what happened, but about recognizing the internal impact of it. Because regardless of whether external justice is visible, the internal effects are real and ongoing. Divine justice in this sense is not separate from this process. It operates through truth, restoration, and alignment. It brings clarity where there was confusion, peace where there was turmoil, and understanding where there was distortion. It does not deny the reality of harm, but it ensures that harm does not define the entirety of a person's life. There is a rebalancing that takes place not only in circumstances, but in the inner world of the individual. One of the ways this alignment occurs is through the release of emotional burdens. Holding on to anger, resentment, or the need for retaliation can feel justified, especially when the hurt is deep. But over time, these emotions can become heavy, affecting both mental and physical well-being. Inner healing does not force a person to ignore these feelings. It allows them to be acknowledged and processed. As they are understood, their intensity begins to shift, creating space for something different. There is also a restoration of self that takes place. Harmful experiences can distort how a person sees themselves. They may begin to feel unworthy, unsafe, or powerless. These internal changes can be subtle but deeply influential. Divine justice works through the gradual rebuilding of a person's sense of identity. It reconnects them with their inherent worth, their capacity for resilience, and their ability to move forward without being defined by what happened. This alignment does not happen instantly. It is a process that unfolds over time, often requiring patience and honesty. There may still be moments where old emotions resurface or where the desire for external resolution feels strong. But as inner healing deepens, the dependence on those external outcomes begins to lessen. There is a growing sense of stability that is not easily shaken by circumstances. Another aspect of this connection is the way perception changes. Situations that once felt overwhelming may begin to be seen with greater clarity. There is less personalization of events, less assumption of intent, and more understanding of the broader context. This does not minimize the impact of what occurred, but it reduces the emotional charge attached to it. Divine justice, aligned with inner healing, ultimately creates a form of freedom. It allows a person to move forward without carrying the full weight of past harm. It shifts the focus from what was done to them to what is being restored within them. In this space, there is a quiet but profound sense that things are being set right, not only in ways that are visible, but in ways that transform the internal experience of life. Freedom comes when the unseen is revealed, but this kind of freedom is often very different from what people expect. It is not always loud, dramatic, or immediate. Instead, it unfolds quietly, as layers of hidden influence begin to surface and lose their grip. Much of what restricts a person's life does not appear in obvious ways. It exists beneath awareness and patterns, beliefs, emotional reactions, and internal tensions that have become so familiar they are rarely questioned. The unseen operates with subtlety. It shapes how situations are interpreted, how relationships are experienced, and how decisions are made. A person may believe they are acting freely, while in reality they are being guided by unresolved fears, past conditioning, or deeply ingrained assumptions. These internal forces do not announce themselves clearly. They blend into everyday thinking, making it difficult to distinguish between what is truly chosen and what is unconsciously repeated. When something unseen begins to be revealed, it can initially feel unsettling. There is a disruption of certainty. Patterns that once felt natural start to appear unfamiliar. Reactions that seemed justified are now questioned. This shift can create discomfort because it challenges the sense of control a person thought they had. But within that discomfort is the beginning of clarity. Revelation brings definition. What was once vague and undefined starts to take shape. A recurring emotional reaction may be traced back to a specific memory or experience. A limiting belief may be recognized as something learned rather than something inherently true. This process transforms confusion into understanding. Instead of feeling controlled by something unknown, there is a growing ability to see and name what is happening internally. As the unseen becomes visible, its power begins to diminish. Much of its influence depended on remaining hidden, on operating without being questioned. Once it is observed, it can no longer function in the same automatic way. There is a pause that becomes possible, a moment between stimulus and response where choice can exist. This pause is where freedom starts to take form. Freedom in this sense is not the absence of difficulty or challenge. It is the presence of awareness and the ability to respond consciously. A person may still experience fear, but they are no longer entirely driven by it. They may still encounter triggers, but they begin to understand their origin and can navigate them differently. The external world may not change immediately, but the internal experience of it shifts in a meaningful way. There is also a release that accompanies this process. Carrying unseen burdens requires constant energy. Suppressed emotions, unacknowledged fears, and hidden tensions all contribute to a background strain on the mind and body. When these are brought into awareness, even gradually, there is a reduction in that strain. The system no longer needs to work as hard to keep things hidden, and this creates a sense of lightness that was not previously accessible. Revelation also allows for integration. Parts of the self that were ignored, denied, or misunderstood can begin to be recognized and accepted. This does not mean approving of every reaction or behavior, but it does mean acknowledging their existence and understanding their origin. In doing so, there is less internal conflict. The person becomes more whole, less divided between what is seen and what is hidden. Over time, this ongoing process of revealing the unseen reshapes how life is experienced. Decisions become more intentional, relationships more authentic, and reactions more measured. There is a growing sense of alignment between what is felt internally and what is expressed externally. This alignment is not forced, it emerges naturally as clarity increases and hidden influences lose their hold.